for coming in. It feels, Aaron, like they're on the verge of war over there, full-scale war. Does it feel like that to you?
Well, I think it's safe to say, Wolf, that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets worse, in large part because the factors for a resolution between Israel and Hamas simply aren't there. You've had three issues. New thresholds have been crossed. You have, for the first time, Fajr 5 or the equivalent used against Tel Aviv. It fell short.
That's a missile.
Right, clearly with a range of 60 to 70 kilometers, number one. Number two, the politics are bad. Hamas is trying to consolidate its authority and maintain the legitimacy of armed struggle and is being outmaneuvered by these small jihadi groups who are responsible for some of the rocketing. And Netanyahu is under pressure from the southern communities to stop the rocket fire. And you got Israeli elections in January. So that's another problem.
You agree with that analysis,
Well, the thing is, I think that there is definitely a chance of escalation. We see it partly driven by politics, partly driven by strategy. But I also think that we shouldn't take, the mobilization at face value. If they're ultimately going to have to negotiate a ceasefire, whether it is after escalation, before escalation, and they both have to send a message that they have an upper hand, that they have more in store. Hamas is now signaled that it can hit Tel Aviv. The Israelis have called reserves or said that they plan to call reserves. And so they both have to do that. But I think in the short term, I really don't see it in their interest to do so. More importantly, it's not in the interest of any of their allies. Certainly the U.S. doesn't want to see this happen. The Egyptians, who are the allies of Hamas, it puts them in a difficult position. They don't really want to be in a situation of confrontation with Israel at this point. Certainly other friends of Hamas, including the Turks, don't want to see an escalation. So it puts a lot of pressure on the player on the outside to intervene to end this.
Well, let me ask you that. What role should the U.S. play in this? What should the U.S. do, if anything, to stop this latest string of violence? Well,
you had a trial run in 08 and 09 when Barack Obama was not yet an inaugurated president, and our options then were very limited. This played out in Operation Cast Lead, and it was extremely costly. I mean, the American options are limited. We can certainly work with the Israelis to try to urge restraint, assuming that the Egyptians, the Qataris, the Turks are willing to lean on Hamas and the other jihadis in order to provide the political space and time for a resolution. I mean, I think Shively's right that it's neither in Israel nor Hamas's interest to see this escalate. The question is, you've crossed some new thresholds, and this thing has to be put back on the box.
Because you just had a high-level delegation from Qatar going to Gaza. I suppose if somebody could intervene and try to create a ceasefire, maybe the Qataris. I don't see the Egyptians right now doing much.
Well, the Qataris can only because they provide financial support. But ultimately, for Hamas, the strategic partner, the strategic ally in the long term is the Egyptian government, and particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. That is really where it's all going to be. There's a lot of pressure on Morsi. I mean, you can see already, I think.
Morsi is the president of Egypt.
The president of Egypt. There's a lot of, tomorrow we're likely to see demonstrations by his own party, the Muslim Brotherhood, in the streets of Cairo.
In support of Hamas.
In support of Hamas, and asking for doing more beyond recalling the Egyptian ambassador from Israel, where he's being taunted from the opposition of people who are pro-Mubarak, saying, how different are you from Mubarak?
Is the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty about to collapse, Aaron?
I don't think so. I think Morsi does have an objective, however, to empty it of most of its content. He's not prepared to do it in a revolutionary way. He'd like to see it evolve over time, in large part because he can't afford a confrontation with the Israelis. He needs the IMF loan, he needs American support, and he needs the goodwill of the international community to address Egypt's economic problems.
Now, of course, it's no surprise that there's a lot of talk of there's more to this than we see on the surface, that there's more going on behind the scenes, that Iran is involved and has its fingers in this as well. What do you think?
Well, Iran, of course, is involved indirectly in the sense that some of the missiles, including the ones that hit Tel Aviv, the Fajr 5, are actually supplied by Iran. So they are. But I think the decisions are probably not Iranian decisions. I think it is. There's, in a way, when you look at the last few months, both Hamas and Israel have actually been relatively restrained. There's been an escalation. In the Gaza Strip, it started off by fringe groups. The Israelis always respond. But there was a little bit of an escalation even by Hamas, partly because of pressure from extremists when Hamas is saying, why aren't you responding to Israeli attacks? And partly because they may have thought they had a window of opportunity in the Israeli election. There was an assumption that Israel is unlikely, actually, to launch a major attack, certainly a ground war, just before the election. And so in some ways, both were trapped in a political dance that led to an escalation. The problem with escalation is you can't control it.
Right. You don't know where it's going to wind up, and this thing could really escalate if Hezbollah in the north gets involved, the Syrians try to divert attention from their problems, they get involved in the Golan Heights. We see instability in Jordan right now. Forget about the rest of the region. If you were advising the President of the United States, Aaron, and you worked with several U.S. presidents, secretaries of state, what would you tell him to do?
Well, first of all, he's got to use the relationship that he has. And
With
remember, look, our traditional partners in this region, there are three. The most important have been with us for the longest. There's the Israelis, the Egyptians, and the Saudis. Each have to be mobilized to the degree that they can in order to, on the Israeli side, exercise a measure of restraint, and on the Egyptian side, to try to get Morsi. I mean, after all, the Brotherhood, Hamas is an offshoot of the Brotherhood. He does have influence, as Shipley pointed out. They are dependent on him. But this is not a traditional situation where the United States can walk in and broker a conflict, let's say, between Israelis and Palestinians. We do not have a relationship with one of the major combatants. I'm not arguing
Hamas,
that I'm not arguing
the U.S. regards as a terrorist organization.
I'm not arguing that we do, but or that we should, but it does impose certain limitations on what we can do.
Quickly, Shipley, you can.
Well, I mean, on this issue, I think that really the administration's biggest lever is trying to cultivate a new relationship with Egypt. No doubt about that. And in some ways, there's an opening, and there was an opening before this escalation. The Egyptian government, and President Morsi, indicated preparedness to mediate a ceasefire. Hamas was responsive to them. They have some clout with Hamas. The Israelis could have used that in some ways to improve, to have a working relationship with the new Egyptian government, particularly through U.S. mediation. I think that's the angle that has to be cultivated in this. We have to worry about Jordan. Wolf, you mentioned Jordan. Yes, the riots over the gas prices there have been pretty extensive, and they targeted the king. But if this thing extends beyond this weekend, you can bet that the riots in Jordan will be not just over